The graveyard is silent. Moonlight filters through twisted branches, casting shadows that move like fingers across weathered tombstones. The air is thick with the smell of earth and decay. Somewhere in the distance, you hear it, the sound of scraping, of something clawing its way up through packed soil. This is not the cemetery of your imagination, where the dead rest peacefully beneath carefully tended grass. This is the graveyard of memory, of history, of stories we've told ourselves when we needed to explain the unexplainable. And tonight, we're here to dig. For as long as humans have buried their dead, we have feared their return. The corpse that won't stay down, the body that rises, driven by something that is no longer quite human. We gave this fear a name. We gave it a face. We gave it a hunger that could never be satisfied. We called it the zombie. But the zombie is not one story. It is many. It is the enslaved dead of Haiti, their will stolen by dark magic. It is the plague corpse of medieval Europe, rising to claim the living. It is the infected horde of our modern nightmares, shambling through ruined cities. And at the heart of every version, the same terror. What if death is not the end? What if what comes after is worse than dying? The zombie has walked through centuries of human history, from the sacred dead of ancient religions, to the colonial horrors of the Caribbean, to the shopping malls and city streets of modern cinema. And unlike other monsters, vampires with their seduction, werewolves with their moon-cursed tragedy, the zombie offers no romance, no redemption. Only this, the loss of everything that makes us human, while the body shambles on. Before we open this grave any further, I want to ask you something. If you believe these dark histories, forgotten terrors, and enduring nightmares deserve to be remembered, if you believe the stories we tell about the dead reveal truths about the living, you can help us continue this work by liking this video and subscribing to the Midnight Archives. Your support keeps the lantern lit as we explore the darkness, from ancient burial grounds to modern apocalyptic visions. Tonight, we will trace the footsteps of the dead across history. From the underworld of ancient Mesopotamia to the plantations of Haiti, from the graveyards of medieval Europe to the flickering screens that showed us the end of the world. This is not only the story of the zombie, it is the story of what we fear becoming. The story of the living dead. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. To understand the zombie, we must begin not in Haiti, not in Hollywood, but in the dust of the ancient world. 4,000 years ago, in the land between two rivers, Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, a story was written that would echo through the ages. The Epic of Gilgamesh is humanity's oldest surviving work of literature. It tells of a king, a friendship, a quest for immortality. But buried within its verses is something darker, a threat, a promise, a vision of the dead rising to devour the living. The goddess Ishtar, scorned by Gilgamesh, speaks these words to her father, Anu. If you do not give me the bull of heaven, I will smash the gates of the underworld. I will raise up the dead, and they will eat the living. The dead will outnumber the living. Read those words again. The dead will outnumber the living. This is not a metaphor. This is the first zombie apocalypse, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, preserved for 4 millennia. The Mesopotamians understood something fundamental. the boundary between life and death was fragile. The underworld was not some distant realm. It pressed against the world of the living like a sealed door. And if that door were opened, the dead would come. Ancient cultures across the world shared this fear. In Egypt, the dead were mummified and entombed with elaborate rituals, not just to preserve them for the afterlife, but to keep them there. The Book of the Dead was filled with spells to ensure the deceased stayed in their proper realm. Because the Egyptians knew a restless dead was a dangerous dead. In Greece, coins were placed on the eyes of corpses to pay Charon, the ferryman of the underworld. Without payment, the soul would wander, unable to cross the river Styx. And a wandering soul meant a body that would not rest. The Romans took it further. They held festivals, Lemuria, Parentalia, to appease the spirits of the dead. Offerings of food, wine, prayers spoken in the dark, all to keep the departed satisfied, to keep them from returning. These were not superstitions. These were survival strategies. Because across every ancient civilization, one truth emerged: the dead could come back. And when they did, they were no longer the people they had been. In ancient Sumerian texts, the dead who escaped the underworld were described as hollow, hungry, driven by needs they could no longer name. In Egyptian literature, the restless dead wandered as shadows, seeking what they had lost: warmth, breath, life itself. The Chinese spoke of the hungry ghosts, spirits trapped between worlds, forever starving, forever searching. Every culture had a name for them. Every culture had rituals to keep them at bay. And woven through all these stories was a single, chilling idea. Death was not the end. It was a transformation. And not all transformations led to peace. But there was something else, too. Something deeper than fear. The dead were also revered. Ancestors watched over the living, guiding them, protecting them. Tombs were built as homes, not prisons. The deceased were honored, fed, remembered. This is the paradox that would define the zombie for millennia. The dead are both sacred and terrifying. They are to be worshipped and feared, loved and locked away. The line between honoring the ancestors and being devoured by them was always, always thin. And so, from the very beginning, humanity lived with this duality. We buried our dead with care, but also with caution. We mourned them, but we also bound them, with stones on their chests, stakes through their hearts, rituals whispered in the dark. Because we knew the dead do not always rest, and when they rise, they bring with them not memory, not love, not the person they once were, only hunger. This was the foundation, the seed planted in the ancient world that would grow across centuries and continents into the nightmare we know today. The zombie was born not in the modern age, but in the oldest stories we ever told. And those stories all carried the same warning. The grave is not the end, and what comes after may be worse than dying. Travel west from Mesopotamia, across the Mediterranean, across the Sahara, to the forests and coasts of West Africa. Here, in the spiritual traditions of the Yoruba, the Fon, the Congo, we find a different relationship with the dead. Not the horror of Mesopotamian gates bursting open, not the Greek terror of wandering shades, but something more complex, more profound. In West African belief, the dead do not simply vanish. They join the ancestors, the Igun, the Bakulu, the spirits who watch over the living. They are the bridge between the world we see and the world beyond. The ancestors are protectors, guides, sources of wisdom and blessing. But, and this is crucial, they must be honored, remembered. Federal rituals were performed, offerings made, shrines maintained, all to keep the relationship between the living and the dead in balance. Because when that balance broke, when their ancestors were forgotten or disrespected, they could turn, they could become dangerous. The Yoruba spoke of the Abiku, spirits who died and were reborn again and again, trapped in cycles of death. They were not quite living, not quite dead, caught between worlds and bringing misfortune to those around them. The Fon told of the Vodou, spirits of the dead who could possess the living, riding them like horses, speaking through their mouths. And the Congo believed that the dead resided in a mirrored world beneath the water, watching the living from below. To disturb that world was to invite catastrophe. This understanding that the dead are powerful, that they must be respected, that the boundary between life and death is porous, would become the foundation of something else. Something that would cross the ocean and take root in the blood-soaked soil of the New World. In the 17th and 18th centuries, millions of West Africans were torn from their homes and forced into the nightmare of the Middle Passage. They carried with them nothing but their bodies. Their languages were forbidden, their names were erased, their families were scattered, but they carried something the slavers could not see, could not chain, could not destroy. They carried their spirits, their beliefs, their understanding of the dead. And in the Caribbean, in Haiti, in Jamaica, in Cuba, those beliefs transformed. They merged, adapted, survived. The Vodou of the Fon became Vodou. The ancestors became the Loa, spirits both ancient and immediate. And the understanding of the boundary between life and death became something the enslaved could use, not just to survive, but to resist. Because in Vodou, death was not the master, the spirits were. And if you knew the right rituals, the right words, the right offerings, you could call upon the dead. You could ask them to act. You could, in the direst circumstances, command them. But there was a cost. There was always a cost. To disturb the dead, to pull them from their rest, to use them, this was dangerous magic. Magic that walked the edge between the sacred and the profane. And in the hands of those with darker intentions, it could create something terrible. A body without a soul. A slave without will. A person hollowed out, moving only at the command of another. The ultimate violation, to die and yet not be allowed to rest. To be dead and yet forced to labor. This was the zombie, not a monster from folklore, not a creature of fantasy, but a very real terror born from a very real horror. The fear that even in death, you could not escape slavery. The zombie, as it emerged in Haiti, was not about decay or disease. It was about control, about the theft of autonomy, about the nightmare that your body could be turned into a tool, a thing, even after you were gone. In Vodou, there are rituals to protect against this. Families would bury their dead with precautions, mouths sewn shut so they could not be called back, bodies buried face down, stones placed in coffins, because the fear was not that the dead would rise on their own. The fear was that someone, a bokor, a sorcerer, would raise them. And once raised, the zombie had no will, no voice, no self. It was a shell, an empty vessel, the ultimate enslaved being. This is where the zombie was truly born, not in ancient myths, but in the specific, brutal context of colonial Haiti. It was born from the spiritual traditions of West Africa, transformed by the horror of slavery, and given form by the need to name the ultimate fear, that even death would not set you free. The ancestors were meant to protect, but the zombie was the ancestor stolen, perverted, enslaved, and in the cane fields of Haiti, in the whispered warnings of the enslaved, in the rituals performed in secret, the zombie became real, not as a shambling corpse, but as a symbol of what slavery had always been, the reduction of a human being to a body, a tool, a thing without will. The dead do not rest in Haiti, not because they cannot, but because they will not be allowed to. The year is 1791. The colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, is the richest colony in the world. Its sugar plantations produce more wealth for France than all of its other colonies combined. But that wealth is built on blood. 500,000 enslaved Africans labor in the fields, their lives measured not in years, but in harvests. The average lifespan of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation is 7 years. 7 years of 12-hour days cutting cane. 7 years of the lash, the chain, the unrelenting sun. 7 years before the body breaks, and another is brought to replace it. This is not merely slavery. This is industrialized death. And yet, the enslaved resist. They resist in ways large and small. In secret languages, hidden rituals, poison in the master's cup. And in their spiritual practices, Vodou. Vodou is not what Hollywood will later make it. It is not devil worship or dark magic. It is a synthesis of African spiritual traditions, adapted to the horrors of the New World. It is a religion of the Loa, spirits who serve as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. There is Papa Legba, guardian of the crossroads, Erzulie, spirit of love and beauty, Ogu, warrior and protector, and there is Baron Samedi. Baron Samedi is the Loa of the dead, master of the cemetery, keeper of the boundary between life and death. He is depicted as a skeleton in a top hat and tailcoat, smoking a cigar, speaking in obscenities. He is trickster, judge, and gatekeeper all at once. And he has a power that terrifies. Baron Samedi decides who dies and who does not. He decides who rests and who rises. To anger Baron Samedi is to risk being denied death itself, to be caught between worlds, to become one of the walking dead. In Vodou, death is not the end, but it is supposed to be a transition. The soul departs to Jinan, the spiritual homeland, the African shore that exists beyond the water. There, the dead join the ancestors and find peace. But if the rituals are not performed correctly, if the body is not protected, if Baron Samedi is not appeased, the soul can be trapped. And a trapped soul means a body that can be used. This is the zombie. In Haitian Creole, the word is zombie. It comes from the Congo word nzambi, meaning spirit of a dead person. But the zombie is not a spirit, it is a body without one. The creation of a zombie, according to Vodou belief, requires a bokor, a sorcerer who practices the darker aspects of the religion. The bokor is not a priest, They are feared, operating in the shadows, using their knowledge for control, for profit, for vengeance. To create a zombie, the Bokor must first steal the soul. This is done through ritual, through powder, through invocation, through bargains made with the Loa. The soul is captured, often imprisoned in a bottle or clay jar, hidden away where it can never reunite with the body. And then, the body is commanded to rise. What emerges from the grave is not the person who died. It is a shell. It moves. It follows orders. But it has no will, no voice, no memory of who it once was. The zombie labors. It works the fields. It obeys without question. It is the slave who cannot even die to be free. This is the ultimate horror of the Haitian zombie. It is slavery beyond death. For the enslaved people of Haiti, this fear was intimate and immediate. They had already been reduced to bodies, to labor, to property. The zombie was the logical, nightmarish extension of that reality. Even in death, the master could still own you. Stories spread. Warnings were whispered. Protect your dead. Sew the mouth shut so the Bokor cannot call the name. Bury them face down so they cannot rise. Place a knife in the coffin so they can cut themselves free if raised. These were not metaphors. These were precautions. Because in Haiti, the zombie was real. Not as a rotting corpse, not as a mindless plague, but as the body of someone you knew, someone you loved, stolen from the grave and set to work in silence. The zombie became a tool of social control as well. Bokors were said to serve the wealthy, the powerful, to punish those who stepped out of line, to disappear those who resisted. And whether or not a Bokor had truly raised the dead, the fear was enough. The threat was enough. Because the zombie was not just a monster, it was the proof that even in a land where slavery had been abolished after the Haitian Revolution of 1804, the first successful slave revolt in history, the logic of slavery could persist. The zombie was the reminder: your body can still be owned. Your will can still be stolen. Freedom is fragile. And so, the zombie endured in Haiti, not as a creature of folklore, but as a symbol of the deepest fears of a people who had fought for their liberation and knew how easily it could be taken away. The dead do not rest, because the living will not let them. Baron Samedi watches from the cemetery gates, smoking his cigar, laughing his dark laugh, and somewhere in the shadows, a Bokor whispers a name, and a body begins to stir. The year is 1962. In the small Haitian village of Lester, a man named Clairvius Narcisse falls ill. His body burns with fever. He struggles to breathe. His family gathers around him praying, waiting. On May 2nd, Clairvius Narcisse is declared dead. His sister, Angelina, identifies his body at the hospital. A doctor, American-trained, educated in modern medicine, signs the death certificate. Clairvius Narcisse is buried in a small cemetery near his village, the ground sealed above him. His family mourns. They perform the rituals. They say their goodbyes. And then, 18 years later, Clairvius Narcisse walks up to his sister in the marketplace. Angelina does not scream. She does not run. She knows immediately who he is, because he tells her things only her brother would know. A childhood nickname. The scar on his face from a fight when they were young. Details of their family that no stranger could possibly possess. But it is impossible. Clairvius Narcisse is dead. She saw his body. She attended his funeral. She has mourned him for nearly 2 decades. And yet, here he stands. Clairvius tells her a story that will become one of the most famous and most disturbing accounts of zombification ever recorded. He says he was never dead, not truly. He remembers lying in the hospital, unable to move, unable to speak. He could hear the doctors. He could hear his sister weeping. He felt the sheet pulled over his face. He was aware, conscious, trapped in his own body. He remembers being buried, the sound of earth hitting the coffin, the darkness, the suffocating, crushing weight of soil. And then he remembers hands pulling him out. A bokor had poisoned him, had induced a death-like state, had waited until he was buried, then exhumed him under cover of darkness. For the next 18 years, Clairvius says he was held on a sugar plantation with other zombies. He was given a paste, a drug that kept him compliant, docile, unable to think clearly or resist. He worked. He obeyed. He had no will of his own. Only when the bokor died did the drugs stop, and slowly, over months, Clairvius began to wake, to remember, to become himself again. And when he could finally walk, finally think, he fled. It took him years to find his way home, years to recover enough of himself to risk returning. And when he did, his sister believed him. Because in Haiti, this story is not impossible. The case of Clairvius Narcisse became international news. Journalists descended on Haiti, researchers, anthropologists, doctors. They all wanted to know, was this real? Had a man truly been zombified? In 1982, an ethnobotanist named Wade Davis traveled to Haiti to investigate. He was a Harvard researcher trained in pharmacology and anthropology. He was skeptical, scientific, methodical. But what he found would challenge everything he thought he knew. Davis discovered that Haitian bokors used a powder, a mixture of ingredients that could, theoretically, create the appearance of death. The key ingredient, tetrodotoxin. Tetrodotoxin is one of the most powerful neurotoxins known to science. It is found in pufferfish, in certain species of newts, in the blue-ringed octopus. In the right dose, tetrodotoxin paralyzes. It slows the heart rate to nearly undetectable levels. It stops breathing to the point where it appears absent. It leaves the victim fully conscious, but completely immobilized. It creates, in other words, the appearance of death. Davis found that the zombie powder contained tetrodotoxin, along with other substances, ground glass to irritate the skin and allow absorption, datura, a powerful hallucinogen, and human remains, bone dust from graves, meant to invoke the spiritual power of the dead. The victim is poisoned. They collapse. They appear to die. They are buried, and then, hours later, they are exhumed by the bokor. If they survive the ordeal, and many do not, they are disoriented, brain damage from oxygen deprivation, and highly susceptible to suggestion. They are given another drug, derived from datura, that keeps them in a compliant hallucinogenic state. They are, for all intents and purposes, erased, hollowed out, turned into a zombie. Davis's research was published in his book, The Serpent and the Rainbow, in 1985. It was controversial. Some scientists disputed his findings. Others said he had been deceived by his informants. But the core idea was undeniable. Zombification in Haiti was pharmacologically possible. This was not folklore. This was not superstition. This was chemistry, botany, neuroscience. The zombie was real. But here is where the story becomes even more complex. Because Davis also learned that zombification was not random. It was a punishment. In rural Haiti, the Bokor often worked in concert with secret societies, groups that enforced social order in villages where government presence was weak or absent. If someone violated community norms, stealing, betraying a neighbor, refusing to pay debts, they could be marked for zombification. It was a sentence, a warning to others. And Clairvius Narcisse had violated those norms. He had refused to share his land with his family. He had been seen as selfish, greedy, and so he was made an example. This revelation shifted the entire understanding of the zombie. It was not a random curse. It was social control. It was justice, however brutal, enforced by those who held power in the shadows. The zombie was not just a monster. It was a tool. Clairvius Narcisse lived until 1994. He spent his final years in his village, known and accepted. People believed him. They did not think he was mad. Because in Haiti, his story was not extraordinary. It was a known danger, a recognized punishment. The zombie was not a myth. It was a consequence. And the question that haunted researchers, that haunts us still, is this: how many others? How many people, declared dead, buried, lost to their families, were not dead at all? How many are still out there, laboring in silence, their minds shattered, their identities erased? The grave, we are taught, is the end. But in Haiti, Clairvius Narcisse proved otherwise. The grave is only the beginning, and what rises from it may still be alive, but no longer human. While the zombie took root in Haiti, shaped by slavery and Vodou, Europe had its own restless dead. They did not call them zombies. They had other names: revenant, Drauger, Nachtzehrer, Wiedergänger, the walking corpse, the one who returns. And across medieval and early modern Europe, the fear of the dead rising from their graves was not superstition. It was documented, investigated, and violently suppressed. In 12th century England, the chronicler William of Newburgh recorded multiple accounts of revenants, corpses that left their graves at night to terrorize the living. One story tells of a man in Buckinghamshire who died and was buried, only to rise each night and wander the village. His presence brought plague. Animals sickened. Crops failed. The villagers, terrified, exhumed the body. They found it swollen, bloated, filled with fresh blood. They drove a spade through its chest and blood poured out as from a leech. The body was burned. The haunting stopped. This was not metaphor. This was not legend. This was written as fact, recorded by a respected chronicler, believed by the people of the time. The revenant was real. In medieval theology, the walking dead posed a problem. Christianity taught that the soul departed the body at death. It went to heaven, hell, or purgatory. The body was merely a shell, a vessel left behind. But if that were true, what animated the revenant? Some theologians argued it was the devil, that demons could inhabit corpses and move them, using the appearance of the dead to torment the living. Others believed it was divine punishment, that the wicked, even in death, could not rest and were forced to walk the earth in torment. Still others suggested that certain sins, excommunication, suicide, dying without last rites, could trap the soul in the body, preventing it from leaving. Whatever the cause, The solution was the same: destroy the body. Across Europe, graves were opened, corpses were examined, and if signs of unnatural preservation were found, if the body had not decayed as expected, if it appeared bloated or flushed, it was declared a revenant. The corpse would be staked through the heart, decapitated, or burned. Sometimes all three. In the 16th century, Martin Luther himself wrote about the restless dead. He described them as corpses moved by Satan, sent to spread disease and despair. The Catholic Church, too, took the threat seriously. Handbooks for priests included instructions on how to identify and deal with revenants. This was not folklore, this was official church doctrine. Travel north to Scandinavia, and the dead became even more dangerous. The Draugr of Norse legend was not merely a revenant, it was a monster. The sagas describe Draugr as corpses with superhuman strength, able to grow in size, to shapeshift into animals, to bring madness and death to those who encountered them. They guarded their burial mounds with jealous rage, attacking anyone who dared approach. They spread disease. They crushed the living in their grip. One saga tells of a Draugr that killed 12 men before being stopped. It took a hero, armed with strength and cunning, to defeat it, cutting off its head and burning the body. The Draugr was not pitied. It was not mourned. It was destroyed. In Eastern Europe, the fear took another form. The Nachtzehrer of German folklore was a plague corpse. It was believed that certain dead, especially those who died of disease, could chew in their graves, consuming their burial shrouds, their own flesh, even their families from afar. The sound of chewing in the grave was said to bring death to the living relatives. And so, precautions were taken. Stones were placed in the mouth of the corpse, coins, even bricks, anything to prevent the Nachtzehrer from chewing. In Slavic lands, the vampire and the revenant blurred. Both were corpses that rose, both fed on the living. Both had to be staked, beheaded, burned. The rituals were almost identical. What united all these traditions? English revenants, Norse Draugr, German Nachtzehrer, Slavic vampires, was the belief that the dead were dangerous. Not all dead, but some. Those who died wrong, those who lived wrong, those who could not or would not let go. And the living had to act, had to dig up the graves, examine the bodies, destroy what should not be. This was not grave robbery. This was survival. Because in medieval Europe, death was not the end of a person's threat. A corpse could still spread plague, could still curse the living, could still rise and walk. The zombie, as we know it, had not yet arrived in Europe. That would come later, imported from Haiti through colonial contact. But the walking dead, Europe had known them for centuries. The difference was this. In Haiti, the zombie was created. It was a victim, a body stolen and enslaved. In Europe, the revenant chose to return, or was forced to, by sin or by Satan. The Haitian zombie had no will. The European revenant had too much will, the will to torment, to revenge, to refuse death itself. But both carried the same message. The grave is not a sanctuary. The dead do not always rest, and when they rise, it is the living who must face them. By the 18th century, Europe was gripped by revenant hysteria. In Serbia, in Prussia, in Austria, reports of walking corpses multiplied. Mass exhumations were conducted. Bodies were staked, burned, reburied in consecrated ground. The Empress Maria Theresa of Austria was so disturbed by the accounts that she dispatched doctors to investigate. Their reports tried to rationalize the phenomenon: premature burial, misidentification of natural decay processes. But the people knew what they had seen, and the fires kept burning. The European revenant would fade with the rise of the Enlightenment, dismissed as superstition, explained away by science. But it did not disappear. It simply waited. Waited for the zombie to cross the ocean, waited for the two traditions to meet, waited for the modern world to resurrect the walking dead in a new form. And when it did, the revenant and the zombie would merge, and the apocalypse would begin. The zombie, as it lived in Haiti, was not meant for the world to see. It was a secret, a fear, a punishment whispered in Creole, understood by those who lived under its shadow. But in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Haiti could not remain hidden. Colonial powers circled, journalists arrived, missionaries came to save souls, and they brought back stories that would fascinate and horrify the Western world. To the white colonizers and visitors, Haiti was a paradox. It was the first Black Republic, born from the only successful slave revolution in history. It had defeated Napoleon's armies. It had declared itself free. And yet, to the colonial mind, it was also primitive, savage, a land of dark magic and superstition. The zombie fit perfectly into this racist narrative. Early accounts of Vodou and zombies, written by white observers, dripped with contempt and fear. They describe Vodou as devil worship, Bokors as sorcerers in league with Satan, and zombies as proof of Haitian backwardness. These accounts were not anthropology, they were propaganda. They served a purpose: to justify continued interference in Haiti, to paint the Black Republic as incapable of self-governance, to reinforce the idea that without white oversight, Haiti would descend into chaos and dark magic. The zombie became a tool of colonialism. But there was something else too, something deeper. The white plantation owners and colonial administrators were terrified, not of Vodou itself, but of what it represented: resistance. Because Vodou had been the spiritual backbone of the Haitian Revolution. Vodou priests, Hongans and Mambos, had organized the enslaved. They had used ritual to unite them, to give them courage, to tell them the ancestors were on their side. The revolution began with a Vodou ceremony in Bois Caïman in 1791. A Hongan named Dutty Boukman called upon the Loa, and the enslaved swore an oath to rise up. Within weeks, the plantations were burning. The colonizers did not forget this. And so, when they heard stories of Bokors raising the dead, of zombies laboring in the fields, they heard something else: the potential for another uprising, the power to command the dead, the terrifying idea that even in death, the enslaved could be made to serve or made to rebel. The zombie, to the colonizers, was both a symbol of control and a threat of its loss. The first detailed account to reach the wider world came from Lafcadio Hearn, a journalist who traveled to the Caribbean in the 1880s. Hearn wrote of the living dead, of corpses seen working in cane fields, of bodies exhumed and found to be missing. His writing was sensational, exoticized, tinged with both fascination and revulsion, but it was also widely read, and it planted the seed. The zombie entered Western consciousness not as a Haitian reality, but as a colonial fantasy, a monstrous curiosity from a savage land. Then, In 1929, everything changed. A man named William Seabrook published a book, The Magic Island. Seabrook was a travel writer, an adventurer, and a provocateur. He went to Haiti seeking thrills, seeking stories, seeking the exotic and the forbidden. And he found the zombie. The Magic Island contained a chapter called Dead Men Working in the Cane Fields. In it, Seabrook described encountering zombies, real, physical zombies, laboring on a plantation. He wrote of their blank stares, their shuffling gait, their complete absence of will. He interviewed people who claimed to have seen zombies, to have known them in life, to have watched them rise from death. Seabrook presented these accounts not as folklore, but as fact. The book was a sensation. It was translated into multiple languages. It was reviewed in major newspapers. It brought the zombie, Haiti's deepest fear, its most intimate horror, into the parlors and libraries of America and Europe. But Seabrook's zombie was not the Haitian zombie. It was filtered through a white, colonial gaze. It was stripped of its context, of slavery, of resistance, of spiritual complexity. It became instead a prop, a curiosity, a monster for Western consumption. Seabrook's descriptions emphasize the otherness of Haiti, the drums, the darkness, the primitive rituals. He painted Vodou not as a religion, but as something sinister and alien. And the zombie, in his telling, became a symbol of that alienness. A body without a soul, a slave without will, a thing to be feared and pitied. The racist undertones were impossible to miss. The zombie, as presented to the West, was the ultimate image of black bodies reduced to labor, to emptiness, to servitude. It reinforced every colonial stereotype. And yet, buried beneath Seabrook's sensationalism, there was truth. The Haitians he spoke to were not inventing stories. They were sharing their reality, a reality shaped by the trauma of slavery, the persistence of Vodou, and the very real fear of zombification. But that truth was repackaged, sensationalized, and sold. And in that process, the zombie was transformed. It was no longer a Haitian symbol of colonial trauma. It was now a Western monster, a creature of entertainment. And Hollywood was watching. Within 3 years of the Magic Island's publication, the first zombie film was made, 1932's White Zombie, starring Bela Lugosi. The film was set in Haiti. It featured a white woman threatened by a villainous Haitian bokor, played, of course, by a white actor in makeup. It showed zombies as mindless slaves, controlled by a master who used them for labor and, implied darkly, for other purposes. The film was not subtle. It was racist, exploitative, and sensationalist. But it was also hugely successful. White Zombie established the visual language of the zombie film, the blank stare, the slow walk, the obedience to a master's command. It also cemented the racist framework. Haiti as a land of savagery, Vodou as evil, and the zombie as a manifestation of black bodies reduced to tools. This was the zombie that America learned. This was the zombie that would dominate for decades. Not the zombie of Haitian reality, of stolen souls and colonial trauma, but the zombie of white fantasy, exotic, dangerous, and always under the control of a sinister other. The tragedy is this. The real zombie, the Haitian zombie, was born from one of history's greatest crimes: slavery. It was a symbol of the theft of autonomy, the reduction of human beings to property, the terror that even death would not bring freedom. But when the West took the zombie, it erased that history. It turned the symbol of slavery's horror into entertainment. It made the zombie into a monster, while forgetting what had made it monstrous in the first place. The colonial gaze did to the zombie what colonialism had done to Haiti itself. It extracted, it exploited, it erased, and in doing so, it created a new zombie, one divorced from its origins, one that could be reshaped over and over to serve new purposes. The zombie had crossed the ocean, and in crossing, it had been transformed. It was no longer Haitian, it was no longer even human. It was Hollywood's now, and Hollywood was about to change everything. The zombie arrived in America not on ships, but on screens. By the 1930s, Hollywood had mastered the art of the monster. Dracula had seduced audiences in 1931. Frankenstein's creature had shambled to life that same year. The Mummy had risen in 1932. Universal Studios had created a pantheon of horror, and the zombie was next. White Zombie, released in 1932, was not a Universal film. It was an independent production, but it followed the Universal formula: gothic atmosphere, an exotic setting, and a monster both pitiable and terrifying. Bela Lugosi, fresh from his success as Dracula, played Murder Legendre, a Haitian bokor who controlled an army of zombies. The plot was simple. A white woman, newly arrived in Haiti, is zombified by Legendre at the request of a jealous suitor. Her fiancé must rescue her from a fate worse than death: eternal enslavement as a living corpse. The film was shot in 11 days on a shoestring budget. The zombies were played by anonymous actors, their faces painted grey, their movements slow and mechanical. But despite its low budget, White Zombie was a hit. Audiences were captivated by the imagery: zombies laboring in sugar mills, their bodies fed into the machinery when they broke down. Legendre's piercing gaze, controlling his slaves with a mere gesture. The Gothic castle perched on a Haitian cliff. It was all fiction, all fantasy, but it burned itself into the American imagination. The zombie, as presented in White Zombie, was not the zombie of Haiti. It had been stripped of its spiritual and historical context. It was no longer about the theft of the soul or the horror of enslavement after death. It was about control, about the fear of losing one's will to another, and, unmistakably, it was about race. The film presented Haiti as a land of darkness and savagery. The zombies were black laborers, mindless and obedient. The villain was coded as foreign, other, dangerous. The white protagonists were innocents, threatened by the darkness of Haiti, needing to escape back to civilization. The racist subtext was clear. The zombie was a manifestation of white anxiety about black bodies, about the Caribbean, about the loss of colonial control. But Hollywood did not stop with White Zombie. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, zombie films proliferated. Revolt of the Zombies, 1936. King of the Zombies, 1941. I Walked with a Zombie, 1943. Each film followed the same formula: white protagonists, exotic, often Caribbean, settings, and zombies as slaves controlled by a villainous master. The best of these, I Walked with a Zombie, was directed by Val Lewton and Jacques Tourneur. It was atmospheric, thoughtful, even sympathetic to Vodou. But even this film could not escape the fundamental framework. The zombie as other, as exotic, as a symbol of colonial fear. The zombie in these early films was always controlled, always enslaved, always tied to a master. This was crucial, because the zombie was not yet a plague, not yet a virus, not yet the apocalyptic horde we know today. It was a tool, a weapon, a slave. And that meant the real horror was not the zombie itself, but the one who controlled it. This version of the zombie, the Hollywood zombie of the 1930s and 40s, was static. It could not evolve. It could not threaten the world. It was trapped in its role. The exotic monster, the controlled servant, the symbol of distant, foreign danger. And for decades, that is where it stayed. Zombie films became B-movies, drive-in fare, low-budget horror. They were repetitive, formulaic, forgettable. By the 1950s and 60s, the zombie had faded. Audiences wanted new monsters, giant ants, alien invaders, radioactive beasts. The zombie seemed outdated, a relic of an earlier age of horror. But then, in 1968, everything changed. A young director named George A. Romero made a film for $114,000. It was shot in black and white in rural Pennsylvania with a cast of unknown actors. The film was called Night of the Living Dead, and it did not follow the rules. Romero's zombies were not controlled by a master. They were not enslaved by a bokor or a mad scientist. They simply rose. All of them. Everywhere. The dead came back. And they were hungry. There was no explanation. No villain pulling the strings. No exotic island. No dark magic. No clear cause. Just the dead, walking, eating, multiplying. This was not a zombie film. This was the apocalypse. Night of the Living Dead shattered every convention. The zombies were not slow and mindless. They were relentless. They were not isolated. They were everywhere. They were not controlled. They were a force of nature. And most radically of all, they could not be stopped. The film's ending was devastating. The hero, Ben, played by Dwayne Jones, a black actor, survives the night, only to be shot by a white posse who mistake him for a zombie. The final images are brutal. Ben's body dragged with meat hooks, thrown onto a pyre with the zombies, burned. The message was clear. In America, the real monsters are not the dead. They are the living. Romero had not just reinvented the zombie, he had weaponized it. The zombie was no longer a symbol of colonial control. It was a mirror held up to America itself, a country tearing itself apart over Vietnam, civil rights, assassinations. The zombie was no longer them. It was us, and that changed everything. Hollywood had brought the zombie to America, stripped of its Haitian origins, turned into a tool of colonial fantasy. But Romero gave it back its teeth. He made the zombie a plague, a metaphor, a reckoning. And from that moment on, the zombie belonged to the world. The apocalypse had begun. October 1st, 1968. Night of the Living Dead premieres in Pittsburgh. The theater is filled with families, children. They expect a typical horror movie, something spooky, maybe a few scares, nothing too serious. What they get is trauma. From the opening scene, a brother and sister bickering in a cemetery, something feels wrong. The tone is off, too real, too mundane, and then the dead rise. The brother is killed. The sister, Barbara, flees to a farmhouse. She is joined by Ben, a black man who takes charge, boarding up the windows, fighting to survive. Others arrive. A white family hiding in the basement. A young couple. They are not heroes. They are frightened, selfish, argumentative. They turn on each other as quickly as they turn on the zombies. And outside, the dead gather, slow, relentless, hungry. By the film's end, nearly everyone is dead. The young couple burns alive in a truck. The family in the basement is devoured by their own zombified daughter. Barbara is dragged into the horde. Only Ben survives the night. And then, at dawn, a posse of armed white men arrives. They are hunting zombies, shooting anything that moves. They see Ben through the window. A single gunshot. Ben falls. His body is dragged out with meat hooks, thrown onto a bonfire with the corpses of the dead. The final images are stark, brutal, unforgettable. Still, photographs of Ben's body being handled like garbage, burned like refuse. The screen cuts to black. There is no triumphant music, no resolution, no hope. Just the image of a black man, the hero, killed not by monsters, but by the very people who were supposed to save him. This was not a horror movie. This was a funeral for the American dream. Audiences were stunned. Some walked out. Others sat in silence, unable to process what they had seen. Because Night of the Living Dead was not just about zombies, it was about 1968, the year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, the year Robert Kennedy was shot, the year of the Tet Offensive, when Vietnam became undeniably unwinnable, the year of riots, protests, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where police beat demonstrators in the streets. America was eating itself alive, and Romero's zombies were the perfect metaphor. They were us, the faceless masses, the unthinking horde, the neighbors, the family members, the people we once knew, now turned into something monstrous. And the real horror was not that the dead were rising. It was that the living could not stop fighting each other long enough to survive. Romero himself said the film was not intended as allegory. He simply wanted to make a horror movie that felt real, that stripped away the gothic trappings and exotic settings of earlier zombie films. But intention does not matter. The film spoke to its moment with perfect, devastating clarity. Ben's death was not scripted as a racial statement. Dwayne Jones was simply the best actor who auditioned. But in 1968, the image of a black man shot by a white posse could mean only one thing, and audiences knew it. Romero had done something no zombie film had done before. He made the zombie American, not Haitian, not exotic, not foreign, but American, immediate, ours. The The dead rising in Night of the Living Dead were not raised by bokors or mad scientists. There was no villain, no explanation beyond a vague reference to radiation from a space probe. It didn't matter, because the zombies were not the point. The point was what the zombies revealed about us: our inability to cooperate, our willingness to turn on each other, our racism, our fear, our selfishness. The farmhouse was America, besieged, divided, doomed. And the zombies outside were just the symptom. The disease was already inside. Night of the Living Dead also revolutionized the zombie itself. Romero's dead were not the slow, obedient servants of earlier films. They were autonomous, driven by hunger, capable of using tools, rocks, bricks, their own hands. They were not supernatural, they were biological, a plague, a contagion, and most importantly, they were everyone. If you died, you became one: your mother, your child, your lover. Death was no longer the end. It was a transformation, and the person you loved would return to devour you. This was the modern zombie, the zombie we know today, and it was born in 1968 in a low-budget black and white film that no one expected to matter. But it did matter. Night of the Living Dead became a cultural phenomenon. It played midnight screenings for years. It was analyzed, debated, studied. It influenced everything that came after, not just zombie films, but horror itself. It proved that horror could be political, that monsters could be metaphors, that the scariest thing on screen was not the creature, but the reflection it cast of ourselves. Romero would return to the zombie again and again: Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Land of the Dead. Each film used the zombie to critique a different aspect of American society: consumerism, militarism, class division. But Night of the Living Dead was the genesis. The moment the zombie stopped being a slave and became a plague. The moment the apocalypse was born, and it all began with a farmhouse, a group of frightened people, and the dead clawing at the walls. The revolution was not televised. It was filmed in black and white, on a shoestring budget, in rural Pennsylvania. And it changed everything. 10 years after Night of the Living Dead, George Romero returned to the dead, but this time, the apocalypse had evolved. In 1978, Romero released Dawn of the Dead, and he took the zombies to the mall. The film opens weeks after the initial outbreak. Society has collapsed. The military is losing. The news media broadcasts desperate, contradictory information. 4 survivors, 2 SWAT officers, a traffic reporter and his girlfriend, steal a helicopter and flee the city. They land on the roof of a massive shopping mall in suburban Pennsylvania. The mall is overrun with zombies, shambling through the aisles, pressing against the storefronts, moving with a strange, aimless purposelessness. The survivors clear the mall, barricade the entrances, and make it their sanctuary. And then, they live. They move into the department stores. They wear expensive clothes. They eat gourmet food. They play with the merchandise, guns, jewels, televisions. They have everything. The entire consumer paradise of America, all to themselves. And yet they are miserable, because the abundance means nothing. The products are empty. The paradise is a prison. And outside, the zombies keep coming. Dawn of the Dead is not subtle. Romero himself said, "I wanted to make a film about how we are zombies. The survivors are trapped in a temple of consumerism, surrounded by the undead who once worshipped there. The zombies return to the mall not because they are hungry, not just because they are hungry, but because of memory, because they remember on some primal level that this place mattered to them. One character asks, "Why do they come here?" Another answers, "Some kind of instinct. Memory of what they used to do. This was an important place in their lives." The mall is a monument to American consumerism, and the zombies are its congregation, mindlessly circling, reaching for products they no longer understand, driven by a hunger that cannot be satisfied. They are us, not metaphorically, literally. Romero's genius was making the audience complicit. We watch the survivors loot the mall, and we want to join them. We see the abundance, the toys, the luxury, and we feel the same pull the zombies do. We are not different from the horde. We are the horde. The film's critique of consumerism was perfectly timed. The 1970s were the dawn of the modern consumer age. Malls were spreading across America, temples of commerce where people gathered not out of need, but out of ritual. Shopping had become an identity, a pastime, a replacement for community, and Romero saw it clearly. We were already zombies. The apocalypse had already happened. We were just too busy shopping to notice. But Dawn of the Dead is also a tragedy. The survivors are not just trapped by the zombies. They are trapped by their own greed, their own inability to leave. They have everything they could want. They could escape, could search for other survivors, could try to rebuild. But they stay because the mall is safe, comfortable, full of things, and that comfort kills them. A biker gang arrives, seeking to loot the mall. The survivors defend it, not because they need to, but because they have come to see it as theirs. In the ensuing battle, the defenses are breached. The zombies pour in. The survivors are scattered, devoured, destroyed. The mall, their sanctuary, their prison, becomes their tomb. The final image is devastating. The two surviving characters escape in the helicopter, but they have almost no fuel. The implication is clear. They will not make it. They have escaped the mall, but not the apocalypse. There is no salvation, only delay. Dawn of the Dead became a massive hit. It was gorier, more satirical, more colorful than Night. It also cemented the rules of the zombie apocalypse that would dominate for decades. The zombies are everywhere. Society has collapsed. Survival requires a fortified location, a mall, a prison, a farmhouse. The real threat is not the zombies, but other survivors. Resources are finite. Safety is temporary. Hope is an illusion. These rules would be repeated endlessly in the films, shows, and games that followed. But none would capture Romero's satirical edge quite as sharply. Because Dawn of the Dead was not just a horror film. It was a comedy, a dark, cynical comedy about the emptiness of American life. The survivors are not heroes. They are consumers, playing house in a mall, pretending the old world still exists. And the zombies are not monsters. They are shoppers, drawn back to the place they once found meaning, even though that meaning is gone. The apocalypse, Romero suggests, is not a break from the past. It is the past, stripped of its illusions. We were always hungry, always empty, always consuming. The zombies just made it visible. Dawn of the Dead also marked a shift in the zombie genre. After Romero, the zombie was no longer just a monster. It was a lens, a way to examine society, to critique culture, to ask uncomfortable questions about who we are and what we value. The zombie became the ultimate mirror, and what it reflected was not pretty. The Mall in Dawn of the Dead is a microcosm of America. Bright, shiny, full of promise, and utterly hollow. The survivors walk through it like ghosts, surrounded by abundance, starving for meaning. And the zombies shuffle through the aisles, reaching for products they no longer understand, driven by a hunger that will never be fed. In the end, there is no difference between them, the living and the dead, the survivors and the horde. We are all shoppers in the temple of consumption, and the doors are locked, and the dead are coming, and there is nowhere left to run. For decades, the zombie had rules. It was slow, shambling, mindless. It could be outrun. It could be avoided. Its threat came not from speed, but from numbers, from inevitability. The zombie horde was patient. It didn't need to catch you today. It would catch you eventually. But in 2002, a film broke the rules, and the zombie learned to run. 28 Days Later, directed by Danny Boyle, opens with a chimpanzee in a laboratory. Animal rights activists break in to free it, ignoring the warnings of the scientists. The chimp is infected with something called the rage virus. The activists open the cage. The chimp attacks. And within seconds, the infection spreads. 28 days later, the protagonist, a bicycle courier named Jim, wakes from a coma in an empty London hospital. The city is abandoned, silent, littered with the remnants of panic, overturned cars, scattered belongings, bloodstains. Jim wanders through the desolation, calling out, searching for anyone, and then he finds them. But they are not human anymore. They are infected, and they are fast. The infected in 28 days later do not shamble. They sprint, they chase, they swarm. They are not driven by hunger for flesh. They are driven by pure, uncontrollable rage. They do not eat their victims. They attack with fists, teeth, nails, tearing and biting not to feed but to spread the virus. Because the rage virus is not supernatural, it is biological. It is transmitted through blood, through saliva, through the slightest contact with infected fluids. And it works fast. Infection to transformation takes seconds. You are bitten. You turn. You attack. The apocalypse does not take weeks or months. It takes days. 28 Days Later was not the first film to feature fast zombies. Return of the Living Dead, 1985, had sprinting undead. But it was the first to take them seriously, and it changed everything. The slow zombie was terrifying because of inevitability. The fast zombie was terrifying because of immediacy. You could not outrun them. You could not fortify against them. You could barely react before they were on you. The apocalypse was no longer slow. It was explosive. But 28 days later did something else too. It made the zombie a plague in the most literal sense. The rage virus was not magic. It was science. It was a pathogen, evolved or engineered, that rewired the brain. The infected were not dead. They were sick. This distinction mattered, because if the zombie is dead, it is other. It is gone. It is the loss of humanity. But if the zombie is infected, still alive, still breathing, just wrong, then it is something more terrifying. It is us, transformed. It is the human body turned against itself. The film reflected its time perfectly. 28 Days Later was released in the shadow of 9/11. The world was gripped by new fears: bioterrorism, anthrax scares, the looming threat of pandemic. The idea of a virus, invisible, unstoppable, capable of bringing civilization to its knees, felt not like fiction, but like prophecy. The infected were not metaphors for consumerism or war. They were metaphors for contagion, for the speed at which the modern world could fall apart, for the terror that safety was an illusion and disaster was always one outbreak away. The film's vision of London, empty, silent, overtaken by nature, was haunting. Boyle shot on digital video, giving the film a raw, documentary feel. The streets were real. The panic was visceral. This was not a Hollywood apocalypse, polished and spectacular. This was intimate, personal, terrifying in its realism, and it resonated. 28 Days Later was a massive success. It revived the zombie genre, proving there was still life and death left in the undead. And it set the template for the modern zombie: fast, viral, immediate. The apocalypse was no longer a slow collapse. It was an explosion. The success of 28 Days Later led to a wave of imitators. In 2004, Zack Snyder's remake of Dawn of the Dead featured sprinting zombies that could climb, pursue, and overwhelm. In 2007, 28 Weeks Later showed the aftermath of the rage virus and the horrifying speed with which it could return. In 2009, Zombieland blended fast zombies with dark comedy, making the apocalypse almost playful. And in 2013, World War Z took the fast zombie to its logical extreme: massive swarming hordes that moved like tsunamis, climbing over each other to reach the living. The slow zombie was not gone. It would return, most notably in The Walking Dead. But it was no longer the default. The zombie had evolved, and it had learned to run. But the real shift was not in speed, it was in fear. The slow zombie represented inevitability, the slow collapse of society, the gradual loss of humanity, the creeping dread of decline. The fast zombie represented crisis, the sudden rupture, the explosion of violence, the panic of a world ending in real time. And in the 21st century, that second fear felt more real. We lived in a world of rapid change, instant communication, viral spread, of information, of trends, of disease. The slow zombie belonged to the 20th century, to fears of Cold War stagnation and suburban decay. The fast zombie belonged to the 21st, to fears of pandemic, terrorism, and systems failing overnight. 28 Days Later also introduced another element that would define the modern zombie story. The living are worse than the dead. Jim and his companions face not just the infected, but other survivors, soldiers who have devolved into rapists and killers, using the apocalypse as an excuse to abandon morality. The real horror is not the virus. It is what the virus reveals about humanity. When the systems fall, when the rules disappear, what are we? The answer in 28 Days Later is not comforting. We are violent. We are selfish. We are monstrous. The infected are just honest about it. The film ends with a flicker of hope. The protagonists escape, signal for rescue, see a plane overhead. But the final shot lingers on the words spelled out in fabric on the ground: hello. It is a plea, a prayer, a desperate attempt to be seen, to be saved. but we do not know if anyone answers. The zombie had learned to run, and the apocalypse had learned to move at the speed of modern life. Fast, viral, inescapable. The dead were no longer patient, and neither was the end of the world. By the 2000s, the zombie was everywhere, not just in films, but in television, video games, novels, comics. The undead had shambled out of the graveyard and into the mainstream. The zombie apocalypse was no longer a niche horror concept. It was a cultural obsession. In 2010, AMC premiered The Walking Dead, a television adaptation of Robert Kirkman's graphic novel series. The show followed Rick Grimes, a sheriff's deputy who wakes from a coma to find the world overrun by walkers, the show's term for zombies. It was 28 Days Later meets Dawn of the Dead, stretched across seasons, exploring not just survival, but the long, slow grind of living in a world where the dead never stop coming. The Walking Dead became a phenomenon. At its peak, it was the most watched drama on television. It spawned spin-offs, merchandise, a theme park attraction. It dominated pop culture for a decade, and it did something no zombie story had done before. It made the apocalypse routine. The show's genius was not in its zombies. They were classic Romero-style shamblers, slow and predictable. The genius was in its focus on the living. The walkers were a constant threat, but they were not the story. The story was about the survivors, how they formed communities, how they governed, how they fought, how they fell apart. The show asked, what happens after the apocalypse? Not in the first desperate days, but in the years that follow. How do you rebuild? How do you maintain morality when there are no laws? How do you protect the people you love when trust is a luxury you can't afford? And most devastatingly, how do you keep from becoming a monster yourself? The show's motto, repeated endlessly, was simple. We are the Walking Dead, not the zombies. US. Because in a world without rules, without consequences, without hope, the living were just as hollowed out as the dead. They shambled through their days, doing what they had to do to survive, losing pieces of themselves with every choice. The real horror was not the walkers. It was the realization that survival was not enough, that living was not the same as being alive. The Walking Dead also popularized the survival community narrative. The survivors were not lone wanderers. They formed groups, settled in places, a prison, a town called Alexandria, a hilltop colony. These communities became microcosms of civilization. They had leaders, rules, economies, conflicts, and inevitably they fell, not because of the walkers, but because of human nature, greed, pride, fear, betrayal. The show became a bleak meditation on whether humanity deserved to survive, and season after season, the answer seemed to be, maybe not. But The Walking Dead was not alone. In 2013, the film World War Z, based on Max Brooks's novel, took the zombie apocalypse global. The film showed the collapse of entire nations, Israel building walls, China overwhelmed, the US government fleeing to aircraft carriers. The zombies were not just a local threat, they were a species-level extinction event. Brooks' original novel was even more ambitious, a series of interviews with survivors from around the world, each describing how their country fell and, in some cases, how they fought back. It was a geopolitical thriller disguised as a zombie story, exploring how different cultures, governments, and economies would respond to the unthinkable. The novel's genius was its scope. The zombie apocalypse was not just American, it was everyone's nightmare, and it revealed, in chilling detail, how unprepared the world was for a true global crisis. The book became a bestseller. It was read by military strategists, taught in college courses, analyzed by survivalists, because it was not just fiction, it was a warning. In the video game world, zombies had long been a staple. Resident Evil, 1996, introduced survival horror to millions. But in 2013, The Last of Us elevated the genre. The game followed Joel and Ellie, survivors in a world ravaged by the cordyceps fungus, a real parasite that infects insects, adapted here to infect humans. The infected were terrifying. Clickers, bloaters, creatures twisted by the fungus into something barely recognizable as human. But the game's heart was not the horror. It was the relationship between Joel and Ellie, a surrogate father and daughter navigating a world that had lost all warmth. The game asked, in a world where humanity is dying, what does it mean to be human? Is it survival? Is it love? Is it the choice to protect one person, even if it dooms everyone else? The Last of Us was lauded as a masterpiece, not because of its zombies, but because of its emotional depth. The apocalypse was not just a backdrop, it was a crucible, testing what mattered most. By the 2000s, the zombie apocalypse had also seeped into the real world, or at least into how people thought about the real world. Survivalism became trendy. Prepper culture exploded. People stockpiled food, built bunkers, trained in firearms and first aid. The CDC, the actual Centers for Disease Control, published a tongue-in-cheek zombie preparedness guide, using the undead as a fun way to teach disaster readiness. But beneath the humor was something real. The zombie had become a lens through which people thought about collapse. Economic collapse, pandemic, climate disaster, political upheaval. The zombie was no longer just a monster. It was a thought experiment. What would you do? How would you survive? Who would you save? These questions were not academic. They felt urgent, because the 2010s were a decade of anxiety. The 2008 financial crisis had shaken faith in institutions. Political polarization was tearing societies apart. The threat of pandemic, avian flu, Ebola, Zika loomed large. The world felt fragile, and the zombie apocalypse felt less like fiction and more like a rehearsal. The Walking Dead, World War Z, The Last of Us, each in its own way, asked the same question. When everything falls apart, what are we left with? And the answer, across all these stories, was the same. Each other, for better or worse. The zombie apocalypse, in the 2010s, was not about the end of the world. It was about what comes after, about whether humanity could rebuild or whether we would devour ourselves, about whether survival was worth it, if it meant losing everything that made us human. The zombies were just the catalyst, the mechanism by which the world was stripped bare. What mattered was what we did next. And in story after story, the answer was brutal. We fought, we killed, we betrayed, we survived, but we rarely thrived. The apocalypse had gone mainstream, but it had not become comforting. If anything, it had become more honest. The zombie was no longer just a monster in a movie. It was a mirror reflecting our deepest fears about the future, and we could not look away. The zombie has never been more alive. In the 2020s, the undead continue to shamble, sprint, and stumble across every screen and page. But something has changed. The zombie is no longer just a monster. It is no longer just a metaphor. It has become something stranger, more varied, more human. The apocalypse has fractured into 1,000 different visions, each reflecting a different fear, a different hope, a different understanding of what it means to be alive in a dying world. In some stories, the zombie has become sympathetic. Warm Bodies, 2013, gave us a zombie who could think, feel, and ultimately fall in love. The film suggested that the undead were not lost. They were trapped, waiting to be reminded of their humanity. iZombie, 2015 to 2019, turned the zombie into a crime-solving protagonist, someone struggling to maintain her identity while feeding on brains to survive. These stories asked, what if the zombie is not the end of humanity, but a stage? A transformation that can be reversed, or at least managed. They offered something radical in zombie fiction, hope. But for every hopeful zombie, there were a dozen that remained bleak. Train to Busan, 2016, showed a zombie outbreak on a speeding train in South Korea, turning the apocalypse into a claustrophobic nightmare of class division and sacrifice. The Girl with All the Gifts, 2016, presented zombie children, hungries, who retained intelligence and might represent the next stage of human evolution. Cargo, 2017, followed a father in the Australian outback, infected and dying, racing against time to save his infant daughter before he turned. Each film used the zombie to explore different anxieties: parental love, societal collapse, the question of what humanity means when the human species is ending. The zombie in the 2020s had become endlessly adaptable. And then came 2020, and the world changed. COVID-19 swept across the globe. Cities locked down, hospitals overflowed. The dead were counted in millions. And suddenly, the zombie apocalypse didn't seem like fiction anymore. It seemed like a rehearsal. People who had watched The Walking Dead and 28 Days Later found themselves living through a pandemic that moved with viral speed, that turned neighbors into threats, that collapsed systems overnight. Empty streets, masked faces, the fear of infection, the breakdown of supply chains, the question of who to trust. It was all there, everything the zombie films had warned about, except the dead didn't rise. But in every other way, the apocalypse had arrived. The pandemic revealed what zombie stories had always known. Civilization is fragile. Community is precious. And when crisis comes, we are faced with a choice. Do we help each other? Or do we turn on each other? The answer, as it turned out, was both. We saw healthcare workers as heroes, neighbors delivering groceries to the elderly, communities coming together. But we also saw hoarding, misinformation, violence over masks and vaccines. We saw the same selfishness, the same tribalism, the same breakdown of trust that every zombie story had predicted. The zombie had prepared us for the apocalypse, but it could not save us from ourselves. In the wake of COVID, zombie stories began to shift. Some leaned harder into pandemic themes. The Last of Us TV series, 2023, brought the fungal infection to screens with haunting relevance. Others moved away, seeking different metaphors, different fears. But the zombie endured. Because the zombie has always been adaptable. It changes with each generation, reflecting new anxieties while carrying the weight of old ones. Today's zombie is many things. The plague victim, the consumer, the refugee, the infected, the neighbor, the self. It is the body without will, Haiti's original fear. It is the horde without thought, Romero's social critique. It is the virus without cure, the modern nightmare. It is all of these, and none of them, and something more. The zombie survives because it is never fixed. It is always dying and always rising. It is the monster that refuses to stay dead because the fears it represents refuse to die. And so, the zombie walks on. Through films and games, through novels and series, through pandemics and protests, through every crisis that strips away the veneer of civilization and asks us what we are underneath. The answer, the zombie reminds us, is not always comforting. We are capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty. We are community builders and horde followers. We are the living and the walking dead, shuffling through our days, searching for meaning in a world that feels increasingly hollow. The zombie is not just a monster, it is a mirror, and it shows us what we fear most. Not death, but existence without life. Not the end of humanity, but the loss of our humanity while we still breathe. The zombie will never die, because as long as we fear becoming hollow, becoming controlled, becoming the horde, the dead will keep walking. The lantern flickers. The grave lies open before us, the earth disturbed, the stories unearthed. We have followed the zombie across centuries and continents, from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the screens of the 21st century. We have seen it born in the spiritual traditions of West Africa, transformed by the horror of slavery in Haiti, stolen by colonial minds and reshaped for Western consumption. We have watched it evolve from the controlled slave to the apocalyptic plague, from the shambling horde to the sprinting infected. And through it all, one truth has remained. The zombie has never been about the dead. It has always been about us. When we feared enslavement, the zombie was a body without will. When we feared conformity, the zombie was the mindless consumer. When we feared pandemic, the zombie was the infected. The zombie changes because we change. Our fears shift, and the undead shift with them. But at the heart of every version, from the zombie of Haiti to the walkers of Georgia, from the rage-infected of London to the cordyceps victims of America, there is the same terror. What if we lose ourselves? What if we become hollow? What if we exist without living? The zombie asks us to imagine the worst transformation, not death, but the continuation of the body when everything that makes us human is gone. And that is why the zombie endures, Not because it is the scariest monster, but because it is the most honest. It shows us what we could become, what we fear we already are. The horde, shuffling forward, driven by hunger they cannot name, searching for something they cannot find. Aren't we all? The zombie is not a prophecy of the future. It is a reflection of the present. A world where we feel disconnected, controlled, consumed. Where we move through our days like the walking dead, searching for meaning in a landscape that feels increasingly barren. The apocalypse, the zombie whispers, is not coming. It is already here. We are living it. And the question is not whether we will survive. The question is whether we will remain human while we do. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe the fears we bury in fiction reveal truths about the world we live in, you can help us continue this work. Like this video. Subscribe to the Midnight Archives. Your support keeps the lantern burning, allows us to keep digging through the darkness, unearthing the myths, legends, and nightmares that define us. Together, we remember. Together, we understand. Together, we face the monsters and recognize ourselves in them. The shovel rests against the headstone. The grave is open, but we do not fill it in, because the dead are not finished with us yet. And as long as we fear what we might become, as long as we question what it means to be human, as long as we search for life in a world that feels increasingly dead, the zombie will rise again and again and again. So we end as we must, with a warning and a question. The file is closed. The grave is open. But tell me, are you truly alive? Or are you just not dead yet?